Yeah, I know, exactly, around here. People, yeah, there's some noon guests who've disappeared. All right. Want to welcome Carl Skau back here in a new capacity as a Deputy Executive Director of the World Food Program and its Chief Operating Officer. So Carl, please welcome, and you have the floor.
Thank you, Steph, and thanks for inviting me. And good to be back in this room, although in a new role. I've only been with WFP for a few weeks, but let me tell you how impressed I am about the WFP team. Really, this can-do attitude is remarkable, going where they need to go, getting stuff done. I was impressed already from the outside, but I'm even more impressed now, having been on the inside for a few weeks. And nowhere has that been more clear than on Sudan. Only days after we had secured that our staff was safe, we turned around and began delivering. The circumstances under which we are scaling up could not be more complicated. Despite that, and together with partners, we are now doing everything and anything we can in our power to reach the most vulnerable. Yesterday, an interagency mission carried out a humanitarian assessment to Darfur, crossing from Adri in Chad and traveling to El Geneina in West Darfur. This is the first time that we have been able to reach El Geneina since the start of the conflict in April. The team passed through towns and villages that are almost totally abandoned following a mass exodus of people. Most infrastructure, from health facilities to banks, have been destroyed, and those that remain are mostly women and their children who are acutely vulnerable and have not fled because they are and have not been able to flee because they are too scared. Their husbands have been killed, injured, or are missing. These families are barely surviving. Most are eating just one meal, sharing what food they have between neighbors and selling what they can to buy food. Some markets are beginning to reopen, with limited food coming in from Chad. Our team spoke to the communities about providing emergency food assistance, and we now aim to start cross-border deliveries of emergency assistance as soon as possible. I mean, you know, the situation in Khartoum and Darfur is really a full-scale humanitarian disaster unfolding. Populations largely cut off from assistance, and there has been a complete breakdown of service. There is also the risk for a regional crisis, of course, born out of this. And this is a catastrophe of monumental scale, and we really must ensure that this is not ignored and due attention is brought to the situation. Let me then just turn to the Black Sea Initiative. The collapse of the Black Sea Initiative is, of course, regrettable, to say the least. Under the initiative, WFP has shipped more than 725,000 tons of grain, relieving hunger in some of the hardest hit corners of the world, including Afghanistan, the Horn of Africa, and Yemen. WFP relied on Ukraine, a competitively priced, accessible, and high-quality source of wheat. Despite the war, and thanks to this accord, Ukraine remained WFP's biggest supplier of wheat in 22, supplying more than half of WFP's wheat grain. Losing this source is now of great concern, of course. And this is really about keeping the barn door open just when millions are knocking on it. The world needs unimpeded access to major food supplies. Global food security depends now on collective, urgent action. The hungry cannot wait for deliberations or diplomatic detours. I'm here today to brief the Council in an informal interactive dialogue on hunger and conflict. The largest food and nutrition crisis in history today persists. This year, 345 million people continue to be acutely food insecure, while hundreds of millions of people are at risk of worsening hunger. The causes of this food crisis are manifold: climate change and unrelenting disasters, and added pressure from persistent food price inflation and mounting debt stress amid an expected slowdown in the global economy. But conflict and insecurity remains a primary driver of acute hunger around the world. The impacts of armed conflict on food security can be direct, such as displacement from land, looting, or destruction of food stocks and agricultural assets. Indirect impact can include the disruption of food system and markets and decreases access to supplies necessary for food preparation, such as fuel and water. Many of the countries where WFP works are dramatic examples of the link between conflict and hunger. And unfortunately, these are countries with large numbers of people in need. Tragically, it is where critical shortfalls of humanitarian funding is forcing WFP and other humanitarian partners to reduce or cut assistance, in our case, to make impossible trade-offs of prioritizing assistance. So we are in the midst of a global humanitarian funding crunch. In fact, WFP is in the midst of a crippling funding crisis that is forcing us to scale back life-saving assistance right as acute hunger is hitting record levels. At least 38 of 86 WFP country operations have already seen cuts or plan to cut soon. The size and scope of life-saving food, cash, and nutrition assistance programs. That is almost half of WFP's operations worldwide. And let me quickly just give you some examples. Afghanistan. In March, WFP was forced to cut rations from 75 to 50% for communities facing emergency levels of hunger, IPC4. And in May, WFP was forced to make a 66% cut, 8 million people, to its caseload, now only assisting 5 million people. In Syria, we have cut assistance in July for 2.5 million people. Of the 5.5 million people, we rely on our support for basic food needs. And these 5.5 million were already on 50% rations. In Palestine, in June, WFP cut its caseload by 60%, or 200,000 people. In Yemen, food assistance continue. We are also facing huge funding gaps and will be forced to scale down our work as early as next month, with cuts for 7 million people across the country. And in West Africa, most of the countries in the region, Burkina, Mali, Chad, CAR, Nigeria, Niger, and Cameroon, where acute hunger is on the rise, we're also cutting rations. Less funding means WFP is forced to stop assisting people who are only in the hunger category of crisis level. This is so that we can save those who are literally starving or in the category of catastrophic hunger. But what happens is that those people who were in crisis now rapidly drop into the emergency or catastrophic categories. And so we will have an additional humanitarian emergency on our hands down the road if this continues. So we're entering a humanitarian doom loop where we save people who are starving at the cost of allowing millions of others to fall closer into that same category. Ration cuts are clearly not the way to go forward. So my basic message here today is that world leaders must act to prioritize funding for humanitarian response, enhance coordination among aid organizations and governments, and invest in long-term solutions that can address the root causes of these crises, such as conflict, poverty reduction, and sustainable development. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carl. Edie?
Welcome back, Ambassador Skau. On behalf of the United Nations Correspondents Association, we're delighted to see you here and welcome you in your new job.
Thank you.
My name is Edith Lederer from the Associated Press. A couple of follow-up questions. First, on the cuts, how much was the WFP appealing for 2023? How much have you received? And why is funding such a terrible problem this year? And secondly, on Sudan and going into Darfur, did the team that went into Darfur actually see evidence of serious killing sprees that we have heard about? Thank you.
On the funding, what we call our operating requirements or operational requirements are at $20 billion. That's what we could deliver and were to meet those in need of our services. We were aiming at somewhere between 10 and 14 billion because that was the number that we had seen in the past couple of years. We are still aiming at that, but we have only so far this year gotten to about half of that, around 5 billion. So that's where we are. I think, and if you look across the UN agencies and other humanitarian organizations, the picture is the same. 21, 22 were exceptional years. The needs were going through the roof, of course, due to COVID and then to the war in Ukraine and its broader implications. But what's happening now is that those needs continue to grow. Those drivers are still there, but the funding is drying up. So we're looking at 24 even more dire. And while we are, committed to knock every door, turn every stone possible to diversify our funding base, it will be important that our traditional donors step up and support us through this very difficult time. I think on the team from Darfur, I haven't. I don't have much more information than I can share, but of course we have also engaged in assistance to refugees on the Chadian side, and many of the reports and stories coming out of that is deeply concerning and distressing.
Why, a quick follow-up, why do you believe that the funding is drying up this year?
Well, I think you would have to ask the donors that. But it's clear that the aid budgets, the humanitarian budgets, both in Europe and the United States, is not where they were in 21, 22. And again, the indications right now for 24 are quite dire. But that's why it is important to now step up efforts to explain also the implications of that. And those implications go beyond humanitarian, which is our main concern. But of course, this has destabilizing effects as well. It has direct security implications also for us when we make these very difficult prioritizations in countries.
Deji, then James.
Shudaji with China Central Television. Mr. Skau, this April, when the Sudan crisis broke out, I remember the UN claimed that 17,000 tons of food has been looted in Sudan. Now, months after that, do you have more information to share? Do you know whereabouts of these foods are? Because given the fact that 17,000 tons, it's not a small number. Thank you.
No, I don't have information on that. What I can say is that we have moved very quickly to deliver the food that we still had in the country. So we have been able to reach almost 2 million people in the south and in the east, delivering on those stocks that we still had remaining. And part of that was, of course, also to make sure that nothing more was looted. We have also, with existing stock, been able to reach some 500,000 people in the Darfur, but those stocks are now drying up, and so that's why we're desperately looking at ways to get to restock, including through cross-border from Chad.
So is there an investigation on that?
Well, we are expecting the government to also follow up on this, and there are ongoing talks exactly how to follow up, including on accountability for this. We have our own insurance that will, kick in terms of covering for the losses made, but of course it's important also that there is investigation and accountability on this.
James, Beitul Michel.
James Bates, Al Jazeera. So 2 questions. First, I wanted to follow up on Edie's question. You said we should ask donors, but that's easier said than done. Do you think a factor in this is the amount of money most of your donors of Western countries are spending on the war in Ukraine? So is it then, that they're spending so much on military and everything else on the war in Ukraine? Is it the war in Ukraine then is sort of double impacting? It's impacting because of the grain and whatever, but also because the donors are not able to provide the money to you because so much more money is going to Ukraine. Is that a reasonable theory? And secondly, Niger, how concerned are you about the situation there? I know it's not just the country itself, but it's a humanitarian hub for you. How concerned are you about your humanitarian operations into other parts of the region?
Well, again, on your first question, you will have to ask the donors, really. What I can say is that has not been the case so far. In 22, donors quite impressively stepped up in terms of addressing needs beyond Ukraine. There are, of course, also serious humanitarian needs in Ukraine, and we're working actively to address those, including with daily frontline operations. And so there is no doubt that there is also needs, humanitarian needs in Ukraine that needs to be covered. But rightly so, the war has had broader impact, and with the Black Sea initiative now being suspended, we fear that those impacts will be even more. And so, as a driver of needs elsewhere, donors will also need to look elsewhere in terms of their response. On Niger, I think you had a briefing earlier today, from the country team, and our representative was at that meeting. So for now, we continue our operations. We have paused UNAS because the airspace has been closed down. We hope that can be up and running quite soon. That could have caused some delays in current deliveries. We are also in the midst of reviewing exactly how our hub will be impacted, a hub that delivers to Burkina, to Mali, and to Chad. Of course, important now also with regards to potential cross-border operations into Darfur.
Betül, Michelle, then Maggie.
Thanks, Ambassador. Betül Ürük with the Turkish news agency Anadolu. You said that 345 million people continue to be acutely food insecure. Do you expect this number to go up after the collapse of the Black Sea grain deal? And maybe you could share with us any percentage, up by 5 or 10%?
No, I can't see. I mean, you have had the numbers in terms of the spike in price just right after the suspension happened last week. We don't know how the markets will react going forward. For our operations, the impact will be that we have to look for food elsewhere, which potentially can be more costly and certainly will have longer leadways. One of the reasons why Ukraine has been such an important source for us is the proximity to many of our operations, and that's why 50% of our grain came from Ukraine in 22, and already in 23, 80% of our wheat is coming from Ukraine. So we're actively now looking at other ways, but certainly it's going to take longer time.
Michelle, then Maggie.
A follow-up on that, actually, on the Black Sea grain deal. How will you replace the grain that you were getting from Ukraine? Where will you get it from? What kind of costs are you looking at the moment? I think prices were up about 10% yesterday from last week since Russia quit. And Putin has been offering a lot of free grain to Africa. Has Russia offered WFP any free grain?
No, we have not been in talks with Russia about any free grain so far. In terms of our procurement, we always buy where it's cheapest and fastest to get to our beneficiaries. And so that's the principle that will guide us also when we now look at alternatives if Ukraine will not be that source going forward. But of course, it'll take longer time to ship from Canada or Australia into the Middle East than it does from the Black Sea. And so there will be longer lead times, and potentially it can also be more costly.
If Russia were to offer free grain, would you take it?
That's a discussion we would have to have then. We always work on the basis also of full cost recovery, so we don't service any country within kind. But again, we have not been approached for any such discussion so far.
Maggie?
Hi, Carl. Welcome back.
Thank you.
Michelle actually just hit all my questions, so I'll ask you about Haiti. How about that? Because you haven't mentioned Haiti, and the crisis is increasing there, and you guys are also cutting back there. So what's your forecast for providing assistance in Haiti?
Well, I mean, there is some good news on Haiti in the sense that we managed to avert what was, a risk for famine in November, December by a quite heroic effort going into Ciudad Soleil. And so we managed to go through that. Now the challenge really is funding again. The U.S. is our main donor together with Canada, and we need to diversify. that funding base. We're also now reaching out to Latin American countries to see if they could step up and support us on that operation. Of course, the security situation is extremely concerning, but we are able to effectively deliver, and we have access despite that security environment. So we need now funding to make sure that we don't fall back into where we were in October last year. Executive Director Cindy McCain visited only a few weeks ago with the intention of just that, draw attention to our effective operations in order to mobilize funds. She was, by the way, with the DSG Amina Mohammed in Chad on a similar mission last week, and she's this week in South Sudan, together with the other Rome-based agencies, FAO and IFAD, to also look at ways of addressing root causes and help that country also with the burden they're taking on in terms of refugees from Sudan.
Great. Any other questions? Carl, thank you very much. We'll now have Paulina brief on behalf of the PGA. But thank you.